Dr. Sridevi, can we start with today's session?
Yeah, we can start.
Hearty good afternoon to all. Welcome to our 14th session. Today we are having a topic on psychosocial issues that will be taken by Ms. Shreya Singh. So we can start with ma'am's presentation. We can have it for around 40 to 45 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of discussion. By 4, we can have our case presentation, followed by its discussion. We can wind up our session by 4:30. Thank you all for joining in. Over to Dr. Sridevi.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you again. I think we are going towards the end of all these sessions, and I think we became a group actually. So nice to see you again another afternoon. And today we'll be learning more about psychosocial issues. Although we have been telling a little bit in every sessions from the beginning, because all the patients that you brought, everyone had a lot of psychosocial issues. Today we will be hearing from the experts who deal with purely with psychosocial issues. Today we have Shreya with us for taking session. Shreya is trained as a psychologist, and she has worked in many sectors, not just in healthcare. She joined Pallium maybe more than a year ago as a resource mobilization manager, and she works mostly on fundraising and improving quality and basically mobilizing resources in one word. That's what she does, and she does so many things there. Welcome, Shreya, for today's session.
Thank you, Dr. Sridevi. Thank you for such a kind introduction. Thank you, Rajlakshmi, for giving me this opportunity to conduct this session. So psychosocial aspects of care is something which is what really attracted me towards palliative care. I've had different kinds of work experience, worked in different fields. When I was doing healthcare management, I realized that this aspect of healthcare was missing in most of the things that we learned in management. My background with psychology, I think it brought it all together. And it was great to have come into palliative care to learn, especially for this aspect, which is missing in lots of plans of care otherwise. So I'm not very experienced, but I'm really glad to have any feedback on my session. And please, I'm happy to take you through today. Okay, thank you for joining us. I'm sure you've come across this World Health Organization, about their what is palliative care. It's an approach that improves the quality of life of patients and their families facing problems associated with life-threatening illness through the prevention and relief of suffering by means of early identification and impeccable assessment and treatment of pain and other problems, which could also be physical, psychosocial, and spiritual. This is a definition you would have come across a lot of times in your sessions before. But however, now not just life-threatening, I think life-limiting could also be added to this definition. So why psychosocial care? Why is it important? It's for a person living with a life-limiting or life-threatening illness, or the awareness of approaching death causes unique stresses and challenges. It's important because it's not just physical care that impacts a person's life. You'll have to look into psychosocial, spiritual, and other aspects of care as well. This will definitely improve the person's quality of life. And understanding the factors related to a patient's quality of life, I think quality of life, quality of care are terms that you've come across many times in your sessions before in palliative care. And I think this session will take you more in depth through providing that sort of care. In palliative care, you come across this definition of this term total pain. I used to wonder what total pain was, what it really means. And so when a patient reports his or her subjective pain on the pain scale, it is important to remember that the physical pain is not reported by a patient. It is compounded by his or her current life circumstances. Now let's look at a very common example that can happen to any of us. For example, one morning you wake up with a headache, terrible migraine headache. You realize you're late to work. you are stuck in a traffic jam, you reach work, and you realize your boss is unhappy because you were late. There was some task that you were supposed to complete, you couldn't complete, and it's just a bad day. You get a call from home, you have a fight with your spouse or sibling, and the day just continues to be bad. So when you ask me, if you would have asked me before what my score on the pain scale would be, it would be around 7-ish out of 10. However, let's change the situation. I wake up with a headache. I get permission from my boss to work from home. I'm able to, there's someone to take care of me, comfort me through this, make me a nice cup of tea. I'm able to get my task done while I've taken my medication. I've been able to, take care of myself that day, and my boss is also happy, and I'm able to finish it. The same headache would give me a pain score of maybe 3, if you ask me, if this scenario would have happened. So it is very subjective what you experience with, and the factors are not just physical, it's other circumstances as well that affect your total pain. And as a clinician, it's my responsibility to assess contributive factors leading to total pain. It is very important. And I think this concept of total pain is just not important only for the physician, but however, an interdisciplinary team approach working together should be aware of what they can do for the plan of care. Illness-related suffering is much more than just physical distress. We know what are the contributing factors of total pain. It could be physical, it could be psychological, it could be socioeconomic, that is financial. It could also be spiritual. These are the 4 aspects that can relate to bring out, and that's how you can maybe measure total pain. It is important that we look into all the aspects, and I think the definition of palliative care in general keeps emphasizing this fact, and I think we have to just keep that in mind the next time. We'll go through a small case study and which will be continued through this presentation of mine. And we'll come back to Mrs. D again. Mrs. D is a 27-year-old lady who's been diagnosed with CA rectum in 2014. She had chemotherapy, radiation, followed by colostomy. She was referred for pain management, and at the time of registration, she was presented with severe pain, infection, and a foul smell from the colostomy site. She looked very anxious and scared. She had no idea about palliative care. From the medical records and present disease progression, the team had an impression of a very bad prognosis. She's married. Her husband is 35 years old. He's a daily wage worker. Her child is 6 years old and is going to school. So this is about Mrs. D. We'll come back to her, keep her story in mind, and see what we have done to assess Mrs. D total pain and her psychosocial aspects of care and her plan. So what are the important areas to be assessed from a total view of the view of total pain? It's very important. First thing, I'm sure all of you are familiar with this. It's called the genogram. I'm not going to go into details of how to create a genogram, which can be found on videos on YouTube, but this is the first thing that we do is, if you realize that circle is the immediate family, a lot of genograms, people only mention the immediate family, they don't look at extended family. It is important to include the extended family as well, because however, the family dynamics may change for individuals. For example, let's say for a person, a brother living abroad may be the decision maker or the financial supporter of the family. So it is important to know the extended family as well and create that in the genogram. And you also get to know, what the family dynamics are if you create an in-depth genogram, which can be easily done with one sitting. These are some of the legends sorry about the blurry image, but these are some of the legends that can be used to define the genogram more better. If you see, you can see like family dynamics can be different, right? Not all is what it seems. So there could be distrust in the family, there is love, there could be close violence, there could be emotional abuse. So your plan of care, imagine if there's abuse in the family and you're asking the person who's abusive, about the decision about the patient, it may not be as effective, and it may not be the right decision or the right plan of care to do. So it is important to create these legends, which are very easy, just a few lines defining the relationship within the family and with the patient and the immediate family as well. So you can come up with a more, I would say, in-depth plan of care and know within the dynamics of the family. Next, we'd go up to something called the EcoMap, which is important because it talks about the relationship of the person and the family with the larger society. And it is important to know that, for example, the family unit is in between. You have their relationship, let's say, with their religious faith, maybe the church or a temple, the physician, you could add their palliative care team also, the social services, any other community services, their friends, their extended family. Here it's an American example, so the Written County Health Department, but you could have something like the Panchayat. In India, neighbors are also very important. They play a very crucial role in a person's life. So an EcoMap will tell you about the relationship, and I'll come to why it is important to bring the EcoMap. So this is a more detailed EcoMap. Like you can see, Adam, Louis, Michelle, and Greg are a family. If these are some of the legends that you can use, you can see a positive relationship is defined by a straight line. A dotted line could be a tenuous or a strenuous relationship. A stressful situation could be the zigzag line. Arrows are defining energy flows that if it, and I'll come to that. And there's a line thickness which defines the intensity of the relationship. Now, in this example here, you can see Louis the church has a good relationship with Louis. However, the church doesn't have a good relationship with Adam. Out here, you can see Adam has a great relationship with his work, and it's a mutual relationship. There's also with his buddies, recreation, hunting, all these other things. However, his friends don't get along with his wife, Louise. Now look at Greg, who's the child here. The school doesn't have a good relationship with Greg, but however, Greg has a great small group of friends. There's a good relationship with the counselor that the Greg is going to. And look at Michelle as well. She's good in sports. You can see there's a mutual love for her for sports. So this kind of defines the whole family for you and what their relationship with the larger society is. Now, why is it important is, I'll just give you a few examples. For example, you are treating an elderly couple who live alone, and just something as simple as medicines need to be delivered to them. Who are you going to contact? So when you know their relationship with their larger society, it's important, it's easy. We can get someone from the community to help them out, or maybe someone from their place of faith or some community center or the panchayat. We can mobilize these community members to help them out. This is just one example. And it is really, really important to take these considerations, and also like knowing 80% of the times women are caregivers, known to be caregivers. And it would help in terms of planning for care, and also whatever support you could get for a community. There's also an option of, imagine a person on a wheelchair who cannot get out of the house because they don't have a ramp, and the road that leads to the main road is not paved. So even if you give that person a wheelchair, the person cannot get out of the house. So building a ramp can be done through the community, or maybe you could get some volunteers to pitch in and help in building a ramp. Now, even if the ramp is built, how's the person going to go on the main road if the road is not paved? You can bring that to the notice of the panchayat, or maybe some community volunteers who want to help, and bring that into notice. And it's all about mobilizing the community to help the family. And it's important because I think it gives the person's life story a bigger picture, and it will be easier for you to help the family as well. So I think eco-maps are something that can be added. There are a lot of videos on YouTube that could be seen to add an eco-map. So we've had two diagrams that could represent the family and their relationship with the extended family and the larger society. So one's the genogram and one's the eco-map. Also, you need to have an aim of assessment to identify the problem areas which result from illness, which may influence the well-being of patients and their families. The assessment involves collecting information. Now, when we say collecting information, information cannot be collected on the first sitting itself. It's an ongoing process. You need to build a rapport. You need to build that person's trust to collect information from the family, and you need to keep doing it because look, through the different trajectories of illness, the crisis of the family may change. So it's important for you to capture all the information throughout the process. And also, and it is an ongoing process, the psychosocial needs of the patients and family care and caregivers often change over the course of illness. Like I mentioned, initially, the person may have had financial support to be admitted in the hospital. However, during the course of the illness, they may have financial crisis. They would have to take out their children out of schools or colleges because they cannot afford their children's education anymore after 3 months of being hospitalized. So during the course of the illness, the family crisis may change as well, and the dynamics may change. If you realize, if the families were cohesive before the illness, they may be more supportive during the course of the illness. But if you see there's a crisis within the family before the illness had struck, there is going to be more problems post during the course of illness. So these are some of the observations you need to do, and you need to keep assessing during the course of the illness. So assessing psychosocial and spiritual suffering, a lot of people think that counseling is just a lot of cathartic conversations and maybe just a one-way boat where people just come and talk and maybe just express themselves. It's not true. You need to define, it's very purposeful observations need to be done. There needs to be goal setting. I'm not going to go into very in-depth definition of counseling, but there are some counseling courses that are available for people to do, and maybe 6 months and something which could be effective. And speak to, and not just speak to the patient, speak to the members of the family, note any non-verbal cues. If you realize a lot of times the child is left behind, when the patient or the mother or father is sick, we do not talk to the children. Speaking to the children may be different from how I speak to an adult. And so we need to mold our way that we speak to everyone in the family, and purposeful conversations need to happen. There needs to be some sort of goal setting, whether it is not just, giving them more, not asking them close-ended questions like, are you happy today? Or, simple question like, how are you feeling? Noting all these observations. You could not just so when it comes to this, not just the physician needs to do this, you can have others in the team, maybe a counselor, social worker, or, a medical social worker, anyone doing this kind of work, which would help, and it would help in your plan of care as well. So what is the possible psychological impact of illness? This impact could be very subjective, but just coming to a few main points. Psychosocial and spiritual suffering is real, but cannot be recognized, but can be difficult to recognize and treat. In physical suffering, we can check the temperature with a thermometer, or there is some sort of a tool. But however, a psychosocial and spiritual suffering is difficult to recognize and treat. And during the course and impact of illness, there could be feelings of shock, uncertainty, hopelessness, and despair. This is that's something, and losing the sense of autonomy for a person. Like, for example, a person who was the breadwinner of the family and the main decision maker suddenly turns out to be very sick, or maybe has, let's say, cancer. The next day, the life of the person changes. The person is a patient now. The consideration for their plan of care is they are not being considered. No one is asking for their opinion. They're not making decisions anymore. So yes, it can impact a person's autonomy as well. And it's important to consider these facts, that it can happen to anyone. And like I keep mentioning, it's very subjective. I'm just giving a few examples. For a mother who's been taking care of her children, like example, she can feel, okay, now who's going to take care of my children now, right? Who's going to cook them food? Who's going to do all the household work? Just so many questions people experience. There's also something called anticipatory grief. It's knowing that, okay, now what's going to happen? Okay, I'm ill. Who's going to take care of my family? What's going to happen to the future of my children? What is going to happen to their education? What jobs will they get? This anticipatory grief, especially when a person is impacted with a terminal illness, it happens to a lot of people. It can happen to the families as well. What's going to happen if I lose my father or mother or my child? Could be anything. Next is anxiety about death and the death process. A lot of people are scared to talk about death because we feel that it's scary. Like if you talk about death, something bad's going to happen, and we don't generally have conversations about death, even within our families or friends, even with our close circles. So when we talk about death, it kind of makes people uneasy. But it's most of the times that we've seen, it's not about death. People know that they're not immortal. They're all mortal beings, but it's the process of death which actually impacts people, and that actually causes the most amount of stress as a process of death. And I think bringing that to notice, like, okay, so can you tell us about how you're feeling? Or, going through the death process of whether they will suffer, would they be in pain, what is going to happen to their families. There's a lot of this uncertainty about death process that causes them, psychological impacts. And it's as a team, as an interdisciplinary team, you need to make that person feel comfortable. The doctor can, maybe help with the symptom management, pain. A counselor can help with the psychological process. There's so many other things that you could bring in. And also thoughts of suicide and wanting to hasten death. According to a study done by the Economic Times, 1 out of 5 people who commit suicide in India are suffering through some sort of a life-limiting or life-threatening illness. And this kind of statistic is very important to know what a person may be going through. There was a case in Andhra Pradesh, maybe I think around 5 years ago, where the parents were asking for euthanasia for their child, requesting for euthanasia because they knew the child was a lot in pain. And what happened before some of the palliative care teams could actually track them down, the child died in a hospital in Bangalore and died in pain. So these are some aspects, not just the patient, but the family may be feeling they don't want to see their loved one suffering. And these are some things that now thoughts of suicide, or we do something called the suicide risk assessment, which is very in-depth, would need a lot of practice and research to do. But that's something just to be aware of, that it can happen. Also, poor coping with the illness. This is a very, everyone copes differently. There's a lot of, for example, even in our daily lives, everyone's coping strategies are different. For example, something as slight as giving a presentation may be a stressor for someone, but imagine a family that's going through a illness which is very impactful, and what's going to happen to the family. So how everyone copes is very different, and the family dynamics play a very important role with coping with the illness as well. And if you see, psychosocial and spiritual suffering can manifest physical complaints. Like we say, mind can be connected to our heart, body, soul. There's so many aspects of it. Sometimes a headache can be caused due to stress, and various, like we say, various diseases. I'm not a doctor, but stress can inculcate various diseases and stuff. So it's important to know that psychosocial and spiritual suffering can also manifest physical complaints in a person. Okay, now here is a spiritual assessment that we do. And this can be found, it's an Oxford book, it could be found. Just we look into the 4 areas of assessment, which are very important, which is connection, meaning and joy, strength and comfort, hopes and concerns. Now, what is spirituality? Spirituality is, again, very subjective to each person. It could be someone's faith, in a religion, or it could be, for someone, spirituality could be music, for someone, spirituality could be nature. Everyone's perspective of spirituality is different. And so how do we assess how do we do the spiritual assessment is very important. So here are some questions. So what I suggest is, you don't really ask these questions in one sitting. It never works. It's a process with conversations one by one. You get to know within, not the first seating, you're not going to get to know these questions. It has to be a part of your plan of care. Some questions with talking about connection are, who are the persons or communities you look for support? What role do they have in your care? Do you have an image of a power greater than yourself? Has your life situation now affected your feelings about yourself, your faith, or your relationships? Meaning and joy. What has been most important in your life? What are you most thankful for? What makes or has made you happy? What do you feel the most proudest in your life? Strength and comfort. Is there anything that is comforting to you now? What helped you get through difficult times in the past? Who or what is your source of strength now? And questions about hopes and concerns. Is there anything that you hope for? Is there anything that is left unfinished? These are very, very simple yet deep questions, and you would be surprised at the kind of responses that you may get for these questions. Like I said, this can't be done through one seating. It has to be, it's a process to assess these needs for a person. And spirituality gives a meaning and connectedness, a feeling of connectedness in one's life. So it is important to know what their relationship is. And especially when someone is on their deathbed, it's not easy to ask these questions to them, but a simple question can really impact and make a change. Even ask them to their caregiver or anyone in the family, it was important. Again, you need to build a rapport building, and the communication has to be very clear cut when you do the spiritual assessment. So now coming back to Mrs. D. So what have we done for her? We did a genogram, we did an eco map, we did the spiritual assessment, we also did the psychosocial assessment, and now we've come to assessments. We're assessing her need. So what is her physical distress was unclear about her prognosis. There was discomfort due to the colostomy bag. She had fatigue and she had lack of sleep. Her psychosocial, the parameters were strained relationship with husband and his family. The colostomy bag made her feel humiliated, hesitant to go out and interact with other people with the colostomy bag, which further made her feel isolated. She had anxiety about the future. She had this generalized fear of what is going to happen to her. The socioeconomic parameters were, she had lost wages of her husband due to caregiving duties. Her husband was a daily wage worker and he had to now take care of her. Worried about the educational expense of a child. She lives in a very rural area, so as access to RCC, the Regional Cancer Center hospital, was very tough. What were the spiritual parameters that we had noticed? She was in extreme and spiritual distress. She could understand why she had to suffer so much in spite of being such a strong believer of God. There was a loss of connection with her friends and family and community. There's also loss of interest in pleasurable activities. So these are the factors that assess Mrs. D's life, and this is how we assess her total pain, all that could have affected her. These are a lot of important points to note. And so what can we do as a palliative care team, right? Like, how can we help Mrs. D? It is important. Physical aspects maybe can help. We can give her, talk to her clearly about her prognosis, not just with her family as well. Teach her about colostomy care. There is fatigue, lack of sleep, probably some sort of medications can help her. We were also able to help her get educational support for her child, which really, really worried her. And also access, we were able to provide home care to her. even though she lived in a rural area. So there was some sort of comfort that there is a team that is going to come and seek to help her there. In terms of the spiritual aspects, we were able to get a faith healer to come and talk to her. And in psychosocial, we did counsel her and her husband and take them through the experience and what her husband was also going through by taking care of her and this whole experience. And all this really helped out Mrs. D. Now, something which is very subjective again is dignity. It is now a very crucial part of palliative care is dignity, and this dignity therapy was started with Dr. Harvey Max Chokmchow he's a Canadian doctor, and he's been working through this dignity therapy and training a lot of people over the years. What is dignity? It's the inability to acknowledge personhood, and the insensitivity of not acknowledging personhood can be psychologically devastating. Now, for example, what is dignity for me is different from the dignity could be from anyone else. My dignity, my personhood could be something like my independence, my financial independence. I'm not dependent on anyone. For everyone, their experience is different, and especially words like joy, love, all these kind of words mean different things to different people, and it is an important, vital thing to know about a person. The ABCD of dignity conserving care, the attitude to which we are treating the patients or talking to the patient really helps. The behavior, noting the person's behavior and how you behave. C for compassion. Compassion cannot just be compassionate, cannot just come through words, it can also come through action. Dialogue, what you say, how you communicate. Communication is a very important role, and I think communication classes will be given or have already been finished for your class. Yes, and this is all an evidence-based study, and it's been really helping patients throughout. People experiencing a loss of dignity have significantly higher rates of depression, anxiety, and feelings of hopelessness. So a simple question like, what do I need to know about you to help you better, is very, very important. It's important. It shows that you care when you ask someone a simple question like this. Sometimes when someone asks you, okay, tell me about yourself, what's your story, or these kind of questions really can move a person, and you never know sometimes what kind of answers may come out. And for example, if you ask someone, what do I need to know about you, and the person says, I was abandoned by my family. So what does this say about a person? Okay, the person is scared of abandonment, right? They seek abandonment and they're very scared. So what, as a palliative care team, you can assure them that you're not going to abandon them at this point of life in time. The other thing that you need to know, sometimes the answers may be as simple as saying, oh, I love to eat ice cream. And when you say something like, I love to eat ice cream, that means that the person may be liking simple things in life. So a simple question like that could come out. The answers may be I would say, amazing of what kind of responses you could get to a simple question like this. Some of the other helpful questions are, in terms of your illness experience, how do you define your dignity? What supports your sense of dignity? Do you believe that dignity is something you hold within you, or is it something that is taken away? That it is something that can be given or taken away by others. These are simple questions that are important. Like I mentioned again, the breadwinner of the family falls sick, or a person who was a decision maker, they feel that their dignity has gone, because now they're lying in bed. They're not the decision maker anymore. They don't have the ability to wake up or do anything. So it is important. And you've also noticed on the other flip side, when someone falls sick, you see everyone becoming extra attentive. And for a person who was doing every activity a few days back, now can't even get themselves a glass of water because no, you're sick, you can't do that on your own. So a person's sense of autonomy also is affected, and that may be their dignity. So these pictures were taken with the consent of the patient and the caregiver. And this is a very a simple picture. If you can't see the cake, it's written advanced wedding anniversary. The couple was under our care. The husband didn't have many days to live, and sometimes these little gestures can really help the patients and family. You can see the smile on the patient's face. Maybe that was the last anniversary that they had celebrated together. For some patients, dignity is maintained if something of their essence will survive beyond the event or death itself. Legacy. Legacy is something is very important. Maybe someone wants to leave something behind. How people will remember them. It is legacy building exercises are very important. You don't need to have someone maybe write down anything. A simple video recording can be done through your phones, where you could speak. You could ask the patient to speak on the tape and record various parts, whatever they want to say to their family or their loved ones. And some small gestures can really help. And this will make them feel most important, and this is what they'd want their loved ones to remember. So these small gestures can really help. So other psychosocial interventions that we as the Pallium India team does is we do family meetings. We also have supporting counseling. There is cognitive-based therapy-based communication, which is again CBT's. Now it's known as mindfulness-based therapy, but this is done through counseling training. There's also facilitating psychoeducational support groups. We have a bereavement support group called UNARV, which has been ongoing for 8 years now. We have people coming in from many years. It really helps them. We do this once a month. There's also recommending them for government schemes and other financial assistance. That's really important. There are various, at least in Kerala, there are various schemes and pensions which can help people. There's a widow pension. There is a pension for cancer patients. There's a pension for people with disabilities. So there are a lot of these other schemes that people may not be aware of, and maybe different states have different kind of schemes, and you could provide that. And there is sometimes the government or the community may be giving someone that financial assistance. Even kind of referring the patient to an NGO could be provided. You may help them get some sort of financial assistance. So it's keeping, making other, being aware of other organizations that could help, or the community that could help. Linking with community resources is very important. And also vocational training. We also have this project that we call Ujjwal, where we provide vocational training for caregivers. For example, something as simple as a stitching unit, or chicken rearing, or goat farming, or maybe opening a petty shop, so they can continue their livelihood even post the illness or post what happens to the earning member in the family. Also, regularly following up with people is very important. And these are some of the big vocational rehabilitations that we have. There's also, you could see a goats person making umbrellas, whatever suits something as simple. We also have a support, emotional and educational support group, which is called the Kutiputam at Pallium. We work with children of whose education was devastated through an illness in the family. We provide them with education support and other career counseling, and also career prospects as well. We always have to remember to evaluate our interventions, assess how the patients and families are benefited. Good documentation is invaluable. You need to document everything in the plan of care. It would maybe something that was said a few months ago may help with the plan of care moment. So good documentation is invaluable. Whenever possible, use research validated techniques. Yes, you can use various tools, assessments, but they need to be validated. There is an art and science in psychosocial care, just as in medicine. Yes, it is important. It's not something which is, there's a lot of work that is required. And yes. Thank you. This is, there's some problem with the electricity at our end. We'll get back with the video. I'm not sure whether you can see me, but Dr. Sridevi,
Yes, I am here. Thank you, Shreya. Thank you for the presentation. We can take up a few questions before the presentation. The video is not there, but you are still there, right?
Yes, yes.
You can hear us.
Yes, I'm not able to see the screen.
Okay, but you can hear us, right?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so we can take up a few questions from the participants. So Shreya started with a patient story, how every aspect of that patient was managed and how they do the assessment, starting from drawing a genogram or a family tree, and how important the family tree in understanding the support system, extended family, how the person is linked to the society and the community, and how the assessment is being made, and how small things matters many a times. We have been discussing all these aspects in many, I think, many scenarios during every presentation, but still it is how they manage patients with us. Any questions from the participants? We have 10 more minutes to take up a few questions. You can unmute yourself and ask if there is any.
Ma'am, is there any Indian version or our Indian language version of this spiritual questionnaire or something? Do we have it in Paleo?
Not exactly the validated version of the tool as such, but you can refer to FICA tool for spiritual assessment, FICA. FICA. It's a worldwide used tool for assessment of spiritual issues, and it has direct questions, 4 questions in terms of faith. I don't remember it by heart. I don't know, but there are 4 important questions. So it's like a question. You don't have to frame a question under a heading. It's like 4 questions. You can just Google and see FICA, FICA tool for spirituality assessment. That is one of the validated tool used in palliative care worldwide. It's in a form of question. So, and it is used for research purposes also. People do refer FICA tool.
Okay.
Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Maheshwari, you had a question, ma'am?
Yeah, hi ma'am, good evening. As you told, like small things matter. Even I felt it in so many times, especially during my JRship. Is there any course for MBBS, present MBBS students, ma'am, who are doing MBBS? I know it can't be taught with the course, but at least sensitization kind of things, is it available in Pallium? Like they can attend for a week or something like observership?
Hi, Maheshwari, this is Shreya. There's
Yeah.
By a course, you mean like a educational course or an experience based course?
Experience, just as observational observationship.
Yes. We always welcome interns and students at Pallium. We have a lot of medical students and public health students and students coming from psychology background to come at Pallium. They just have to send in a mail through our contact ID. We'll send you the email ID. And we could, if I'm hoping this crisis gets over soon, so people start coming in, yes, they'd be welcome and welcome to learn from us. We learn from them as well. And we really encourage young people to come at Pallium, and they can go for home care and all that and learn from everything. Thank you. It will be great.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions?
Dr. Anand? Ma'am, can you unmute? Yeah, yes, doctor.
Yes. You know, there are many young people these days who are committing suicide. Maybe love affairs or maybe failure in exams. Like, how can you accompany them? How can you help them, guide them? Because many young people are there committing suicide.
Um, Ma'am, it's I understand that it's a very suicide itself is a very complicated subject and it requires a lot of training to work with. However, as a first step, I think schools need to take this up. Kind of make them aware, do life skill sessions. Having a school counselor would really help. As in, what tends to happen is people don't know who to go to. A lot of children don't know who to talk to. There is so much of I would say exposure to so much information even on your phone, or they get so lost that they somehow lose themselves in their self-care. So I think it needs to start from school and at home. The parents need to be openly communicating to their children, and it's important asking your child um, about what's going on, and like openly talking to your children like they're friends. And I think it's a lot of cultural shift that we need to do, and we need to be open with our children. And I think it's a lot of work. I'm not sure there is not a single solution to this. I think it's a whole shift of things that we need to do, ma'am. So I don't exactly have an answer to this. If anyone else does, please add in.
I think there is a huge lot of stigma associated with any psychiatric illness. The moment you tell your patient that you need a psychiatric consultation, they just get devastated. And on the other side, when you see a lot of chronic pain patients, we ourselves tend to think that this patient has some issue, mental issues. That's why they are complaining of pain. So I think as doctors, we should have that fine balance. You should not, especially when you are dealing with a chronic pain patient, there is a higher chance of having a somatization, and we tend to label them as attention seekers, or they have some background mental illness. That's why they are complaining of pain. But we may not think pain as a separate entity which may be causing all these somatization. So that is one thing, and we just casually refer them to a psychiatrist, which is actually devastating for them because they are not mentally prepared to take that news. So that is one part of it. And the other part, if when you think that this patient really needs a psychiatrist help, that has a lot of stigma. The moment you start discussing with psychiatric issues, people really tend to go away, or they just don't want to, because there is a lot of stigma. The moment you tell someone about depression, they tend to have a lot of stigma. Any other questions? So how do you, that's a question from my side, just for the purpose of discussion. If someone is telling you that usually people tell us to give something so that I can die, or just kill me by giving some medications, which is a very usual request. So we know that we try to alleviate the suffering in that situation, but how will you differentiate between a real suicide thought and a cry for help in our patients, in a very palliative care context? If your patient is telling you that I would like to die, how will you split it apart from an actual suicide plan? Any thoughts, Shreya?
This I'm not sure, Dr. Sridevi. I don't want to give a wrong answer, but I think
When somebody naturally wants to go for suicide, will they come and discuss it with us, ma'am? If
I
they
think-
want,
Yes, but there are a lot of people who do. So there are various, I think, ways where people communicate about suicide. A lot of people there are people who do talk about it. There are people who don't talk about it at all. So there are various ways. But when someone is in pain and someone is going through so much distress, I think what can be done is basically assuring them in a way that, okay, as a palliative care team, we can take care of your physical suffering. What is the other thing that is disturbing you, that you feel? And a lot of ways we don't even talk to people about how they want to, what are your ideas, how would you like, how do you think you would commit suicide? Like these kind of questions we don't ask them because we're scared. Okay, are we going to give them ideas about suicide? And so sometimes I think just asking that question, have you had any thoughts, or what are your thoughts, and can you talk to us about it? So these kind of things I think needs to go in plan of care. As being palliative care team, we can look into most help them out with a lot of psychosocial and physical aspects, and maybe spiritual. So I think it would somehow we can save them maybe most of the times, even if they have that thought. I may be wrong, but this is my opinion.
Yeah, even I don't think there is a right or wrong answer in all these things. It's about, yeah, it differs from, it's purely subjective experience, and the management cannot be replicated for one patient to the other. It's just customized thing when it comes to psychosocial issues.
when we are discussing about anxiety of death, ma'am, directly how to initiate the conversation? We can directly ask, are you worried about your death, or do you have any fears of death or anything? Or how to ask that question? I've never asked anybody.
Was that question to me or to Shreya?
Both of you.
Okay. Shreya, would you like to take up that question?
Yeah.
I'll respond.
Yeah, sure. Ma'am, actually, conversations about death, what I would suggest to you is first you try talking about death within your family, first step, or maybe with your close friends. So you need to be at ease about talking about death yourself first, and that's how I think it would make it easy to talk to your patients. Like for example, it used to be really I remember everyone used to make fun of me. I would always ask people how they want their funeral to be. Like I'd ask my mom and dad, and initially like people would stare at me like, okay, this girl has gone crazy, why is she asking such questions, who asked these questions? But now I think over the years, when I ask them again, okay, have you made any plans of change on what do you like your funeral to be? And I'm surprised at the kind of answers that I'm getting. So I think I've made my family at ease about talking about death through these, I'm not really calling them silly questions, but something that is important to them. So first of all, I think you need to get comfortable first, talk about death with your friends, or maybe your spouse or your family, anyhow. So we need to ease ourselves about having conversations about death. And this started death cafes in many places now. There's something called the Conversation Project. It's a free tool available online, which kind of helps people to talk about death, including children. So it's a very, very important subject because a lot of us culturally and in India don't talk about death at all. And so I think we need to ease ourselves out first. So ma'am, I suggest try talking about death with maybe a loved one first and see how you ease into it. And it will help you with the patients as well. There's no right or wrong. I can't give you the exact statement, okay, this is what you need to tell that person at that moment, but you need to ease yourself, build that rapport, and you would be able to do it. It's not that hard. Thank you.
In terms of patient care as a person not trained in dealing with any psychosocial issues like me. So usually patients will tell you that I'm scared, I am worried. So they'll give you some clues. So I usually pick up those words. You just told me that you are scared. Can you tell me what you're scared about? So they may tell that they may not use the word, they never use the word death usually. So they may tell you, I am worried about my illness, the stage of my illness. I don't know where this is taking me. So then I'll ask, okay, you tell me what is going on in your mind about where this is taking you. So most often people think that I think it is bad, right? Because I was okay, I was doing all my activities on my own till last month. Now I am unable to do that, and doctors told me that I cannot go on with further treatment. So I think no one has spoken about that to me, but I think it is really bad. So when I ask them, okay, when you said bad, what do you exactly mean by bad? How bad it can be? So gradually leading them to the point where or we will understand at least what they are thinking. So some people will tell that I think I'm going to die soon. They may really use that sentence, and don't hesitate to use the word death. When you tell them, when you just beat around the bush, they won't understand. If you're trying to tell them that the time is limited, when you say the time is limited, for them it must be months or to years, and we'll be thinking about few hours to days or days to weeks. So just don't be unclear when you talk about death, and we make sure that we use the word death, not like I think things are going really bad, not stopping there, but think that I think you have limited time remaining. I think it's this is what happens when someone dies. So the word death comes in every conversation, after breaking the bad news prognosis discussion and everything. So it's important to pick up from their words. I'm really scared, or I'm worried about my. So you can ask them, what are you worried about? So that's how we reach the topic of death usually. That's how I do with my patients, to take from them the cues, and just walking them through the illness trajectory.
Thank you.
I'm not telling that's the right answer, but that's how we usually do, just picking up from the cues what they tell. Like anxiety, you told anxious about death. So sometimes they say I'm okay in dying, but I'm really anxious about dying. So what are you really anxious about? Most often they'll say, I'm worried whether my pain will increase. I'm worried whether I become more breathless, or will I have a lot of issues when I die? Will I suffer when I die? So we make sure we tell them that we try our best to make you as comfortable as possible when you are dying. We try to reduce the pain as much as possible. Will not make you feel breathless, and then the conversation comes to a point where you can actually ask them, if a time comes when you feel that you are breathless or you are in severe pain, would you like to give a mild sedation, or would you want to be awake all the time? What would you want to have? You want to die at home, or you want to die in the hospice, or you want to die in a hospital? So every conversation will have clarity by then. The moment you start having that topic between you and the patient, it gives a lot of clarity for us. Otherwise there will be a lot of questions among ourselves. Should we do this? Should we do that? Should we send to another hospital? Should we send back home? So if you have already discussed all these things with the patient, it would be much easier to make treatment decisions.
Ma'am, do we use palliative sedation commonly? At least in India, do we use?
Yeah, we do use, but there are indications for using palliative sedation. It is not like commonly for every patient, but there are some indications. I think that will be covered in the session on end of life care, but we do use palliative sedation.
Thanks, ma'am.
If there is no other question, can we start the presentation, or I can maybe take one more question? But I saw the presentation is a bit long story, so I think we may need a little bit more time to go through it. Raju, can you start the presentation from your side? Is it okay in the network?
Yes, ma'am, I can start it. Dr. Punita,
Yeah.
you can start your presentation.
Okay. Hello. Good evening, everyone. I am going to present a case which we have. This patient we had last month in our ICU. She passed away on 18th April. She was admitted with us for 1 month, almost a month. She came for a cardiac surgery. Mm, with the and extreme fatigability, and she was diagnosed to have a rheumatic heart disease and a severe mitral stenosis. For more than 20 years, she was a diagnosed cardiac patient. Next. She was advised to have cardiac surgery earlier. Okay, I'll read out from this.
Hi, Dr. Punita, I think your voice is breaking. You can switch off your video.
Okay.
You off your video, ma'am. You can continue now.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So she came breathless and she was on oxygen support when she was not gave the history. She looked very cachectic and thin. She came from Bardwan rural district near Kolkata. The son who gave the history was about 20 years old. For about 15 years now. Some 10 years back, they have advised his mother to undergo cardiac surgery, mitral valve replacement, but they couldn't. Was on some medications and she was on irregular follow-up. She will take medications only when she has some severe breathlessness or severe symptoms. Otherwise, she would discontinue.
Dr. Punita, your voice is breaking in between.
Okay.
Are you there in a good connectivity area, ma'am?
Yeah, I'll try to use a headphone.
Okay, ma'am. That would be better, I suppose.
Hello? Is it audible?
Yes, it is. You can continue, ma'am.
So next slide, you can take the next slide. So the about her illness at around age of
Ma'am, your voice is very feeble.
okay, yeah, I'll just now are you able to hear me?
Yes, it is better now.
Okay, so at the age of 25 only, she was first diagnosed to have rheumatic heart disease when she delivered her second son. Until age 25, she was almost okay only. She didn't have a major health illness. And around the age of 30, her symptoms were slowly worsening and she had to go to the doctor for that. And she was taking some on and off medications. At the age of 35, her valve disease worsened. It became a critical stenosis and she developed pulmonary hypertension, and she was at 42, that is present thing currently. So she came to our hospital for surgery because she waited and waited and they didn't take up for surgery, so she came and got admitted in our medical college hospital. Past history, she has no significant other history, like she's not diabetic, not hypertensive, no tuberculosis in the past. Her kidneys were good at the time of admission. Only thing was like she was in congestive symptoms like congestive hepatomegaly, and she had some yellowishness of her skin, had some jaundice when she was admitted, and she was oxygen dependent when she was admitted. She in the past she has had 2 deliveries, both were normal deliveries, but during the second delivery she developed heart failure symptoms, and she was managed for around a week or so and she was discharged. Otherwise no significant past history. Next slide, Raji. So about the family, she has a broken family, like she doesn't live with the husband. The the husband has left her like very early itself. Now her elder son and the younger son are living in a village where the sister also lives, but they are not in very good understanding. Elder son has finished his schooling. He is doing a evening college, and morning time he'll drive auto rickshaw. And the younger son is going to school. In the same village, she was working in that midday meal program. She used to be the assistant to the cook who was working there, and she was paid something, and they used to give her food and other things. So she was managing the family like that. She was married at the age of 18, and she had a dispute and separated from the husband at the age of 20. But by the time she had had her first child, and then after 5 years she has reunited with the husband. Then the second child was born, and she goes into failure and was admitted long time in the hospital. And after that they had some disputes again. The husband was alcoholic. In another 5 years or so, again she gets separated. Around the age of 30, she's again separated. She comes to the village where the sister lives with the children, and she started working in that school there. So she used to have physical abuse. The husband used to beat her, and he felt she is useless and not she's not contributive to the family. And after she started supporting the family, like she was working in that school, and the school gave education for the children also. And after the high school, the son started earning by driving auto rickshaw. So they thought they can undergo, so she can save some money and take up a heart surgery to improve her health. So there is other supportive system. Is the sister is there, but she didn't tell. This is the history was given by the son. The son is telling. They're not very supportive, but they can do some, like the younger son was taken care by the neighbor and the sister together. To the hospital, both son and mother only came, and there was no one else accompanying. The next slide. Psychosocial spiritual history. Actually speaking, we have not taken any history in a systematic way. She was admitted for surgery, and with the son, whatever the son spoke some Hindi, and basically they're Bengalis. Whatever history we could take, we have taken. But in this aspect, definitely in a psychological aspect or spiritual aspect, I didn't know what history to be taken, frankly. So whatever I could make out, I have just put it in the points. Patient is unable to give complete history. She was admitted to ICU. She communicated by actions sometimes, rarely, but she generally prefers to keep quiet until otherwise she wants something, then only she would show some actions to the nurse nearby or something like that. Or when the son comes inside the room to see her, she will try to talk to him for some 5-10 minutes, and she will ask about money, how he's managing, how he's eating food, because she's inside the ICU, the son is outside. I have seen her talking to the son, asking did he eat, what is he doing, all that. The counseling for the surgery and the risk involved was all discussed with the son, and not with the mother, with the patient. We had a Bengali translator or a department translator, but that person was not knowing him or any his situation. He just translated whatever we told, and he will translate what the son tells to us. um, and the high risk of surgery was explained. She already had right heart failure, and she had the chances of renal failure. She had a big clot in her left atrium, so the chance of getting stroke during the surgery also was explained. The possibility of death was also explained to the son, but the son was willing to take all the risk, and he told us like he has saved money for this surgery only and came all the way from Kolkata. So they then he signed the consent for the surgery on behalf of the mother, and the mother also, the patient also signed the consent, but she didn't read or ask anything. um, The story is like they have saved money for at least some 3 years to undergo surgery, and they left the village after saving 1 lakh rupees, and um, has come to Bangalore. None of us spoke in detail to the patient due to her breathlessness or language, or maybe we didn't know what to talk to her. She signed the consent for surgery without asking any further details. But she looked calm and not so much in mental distress or anxiety before surgery. I did not see any anxiety or distress in her face, but she was quite withdrawn from the environment. She wouldn't talk by herself. So the surgery went on, and post surgery, unfortunately, she had after the mitral valve was repaired, she had a lot of bleeding, and there was a big clot near the IVC, and we had to re-explore her on the very next day. There was a lot of blood loss and blood transfusions, which made her further sick, and her recovery was prolonged because of this episode. So almost for a week, we couldn't get her out of ventilator and inotropic support. She was on ventilator for a long time. Whenever she wakes up, she used to tell that she has pain in her throat. And we were giving her paracetamol and mm, fentanyl to manage the pain. She was after 5 days we tried and extubated her. She was still not very uh, her inotropic support was not weaned off. Still she was sick. NG feeds was started little by little, but she used to look very tired. But to me she looked hopeful only. She would uh, whatever we tell, she would give answer for that, and she'll obey the commands. uh, all that she if we try to assess her pain, she will properly respond to us with her actions only. She would never try to talk. She used to have a nasal prong or a oxygen mask, but she would try to communicate to us with her action. The respiratory I used to wonder why she's not talking. Is it only because of the respiratory reserve or the language or what? But she wouldn't talk to us. She talked very very rarely. In the second week, her physical condition deteriorated. She was in hypoalbuminemia, and she had a swollen body, and we had to transfuse IV albumin. And this was the expenses were going up, and the son couldn't really afford. But still, the care was going on, like getting her out of Foley's catheter, mobilizing her to wheelchair, taking out the Riles tube and allowing her to take oral diet and trying to talk to her, and all was going on. For all our post-op patients, we used to give an incentive spirometer and make them do. But for her, she was looking so thin, so cachectic, she couldn't do much. She had pulmonary hypertension. She was not able to do much, but still we used to encourage her, and she used to do whatever was possible for her. And when the son comes, sometimes I have seen her talking to the son in a very low husky voice. I have seen, and to the bedside nurse, sometimes she talks. She tells that there is one more son in the village, but this is all after the nurse initiating a conversation. She will tell. When we go for rounds and stand and talk and all, she wouldn't talk much, but the nurses have told that she has initiated conversation. Like she has responded to their conversation once or twice. um, Meanwhile, the son was exhausted of all the money whatever he has brought, and it was already 2 weeks in ICU. So they were in a hurry to shift her to the ward. The son will come every day and ask, when will you shift my mom to the ward? I can't bear the ICU expenses. And that was the same time when COVID was there, like in March end and April beginning. So we were scared to shift her in a hurry. Um, and it was this time that again she started deteriorating. The next slide, Raji. The third week, she got a right-sided bacterial pneumonia with Acinetobacter. No antibiotic was she was not responding to any antibiotic. Tigecycline was only one which was sensitive, so we had to start tigecycline for her, but it was expensive. Like for one vial we had to spend some 1,000 rupees or so. So we had to give for 7 days. It was 14,000 for antibiotic costs. Son couldn't really bear with that. We pulled in some funds and all from here and there, and we started sponsoring some medications. Like one or the other of the doctors will sponsor. The nurses would arrange food for the son from the dietary and all that. So as such, they were somehow managing. The son used to talk to somebody in the village, but he wouldn't also discuss many things to us. But he'll tell whatever possible he will arrange, but he will not come back, and the timing for the dose would have been there, but somehow we would pool in some money and we will give some antibiotics. After the antibiotics, she improved in 1 or 2 days or some 3 days. So we gave a trial of extubation, but it didn't work out much. Meantime, we used to have regular counseling with the son. We used to tell that her condition is worsening. We thought she should have gone to ward by now, but because of the pneumonia, she has worsened again, and there is a chance that she might lose her life and all. But during every counseling, the son will end up crying, and probably we couldn't get across our point, or we don't know, we did not listen to him properly, or the counseling session didn't go. It was not a very planned counseling or a protocol based counseling. We did it in our own ways, and it was not so effective. I feel retrospectively, I feel we didn't effectively counsel the patient. On the fourth week, whenever we used to go for visit, she would just tell us, "You extubate and send me to the ward. I want to go home." She wouldn't talk to anybody. Sometimes she showed mild aggression also. If we try to tell her to do incentive or something like that, then she'll get aggressive. But otherwise, not always. Hmm. And the fourth week, she had one cardiac arrest, and we revived her with a shock. I really uh, don't know, was that the right thing that we did? We should have done a resuscitation or not? I really don't understand. But she worsened after that. After that cardiac arrest, her inotropes again picked up. Like whatever was on tablets, we had to convert back to all IV inotropes again. And at this time, we also spoke to the son, telling that there is no way that you can think about discharge, because the son and mother will always talk about discharge. They wanted to go back to their town, and COVID was always already there, and it was locked down everywhere, and many other problems were happening around in the environment also. The son, at this time, the son was not able to afford even his own food and accommodation. He left the accommodation and he came out, and he was staying in the hospital benches only. And our nurses used to arrange for some hospital dietary meal for him free of cost. So they couldn't afford ventilator charges, and we, as a last resort, we thought we'll do a tracheostomy and wean her. And after tracheostomy, we could wean her out of ventilator, but still on and off she used to have CPAP support, BiPAP support. And few times she herself will tell, "Don't take the machine out." Initially, in the third and fourth week, she used to tell, "I want to go to the ward. You take this machine off, take this tube off." But towards the end, the last 2-3 days at least, she used to tell, "Keep the machine, keep the machine." So it was like that. We checked COVID also on her. She was negative. It was just the bacterial pneumonia which took her down. And finally, on April 18th, her cardiac failure worsened, and due to multiple organ dysfunction, she expired. Next slide. So in this case, probably she was in a long-term ICU patient. She is a chronic patient. Like her cardiac disease history is for past 15 years. So definitely psychosocial aspects should have been discussed. Maybe we didn't effectively discuss with the patient or the attender, I felt. So communication barriers with the son and the patient were there. About the tracheostomy, the decision of the tracheostomy or to do CPR and resuscitate her, all that decision, maybe we could have had a detailed session communication, which would have taken us in a different pathway. We would not have, she need not have struggled in the end so much. And about the counseling sessions, whenever we used to talk to the son used to end up crying, I told. With every of my colleagues also, they also had the same thing. They'll go and try to explain him, this is all not of that much, whatever you're taking risk and spending, we don't know whether we can cure her. It is she might die, she might lose her life, all that we have told. But he would always tell, I have whatever it takes, you try to save my mother, whatever it takes, you try to save my mother. This is what he'll tell, and he'll just cry. He will never try to take the message what we have told. Finally, I had like the before the day of death, or on April 16 or 17, I thought I should talk to the patient. This is probably her last stage or something. What is she undergoing? Why is she getting aggressive sometimes? Maybe there are some unresolved questions in her, so I should talk to her. And I went and talked to her for some time, like what is troubling you, what's happening, and all. Then she told that she is not comfortable with the tracheostomy. She has pain, and she told, she showed her hand, like her son, and she told she's worried about her son and all that. And after listening to her for 10-15 minutes, I told, we will try to help you with the pain and all, but there is no way that immediately we can discharge you. You should know that your health condition is not improving, but we are doing our best. And your son has um, actually taken care of you well. He, from his being so young, still he has brought you here for treatment, and he's a smart one. He will take care of his brother. You He's autonomous now. You don't have to worry much about your son. All this I told. And at last she told, you don't take this BiPAP machine, you keep this BiPAP machine for me. Before she used to tell, take out the machine, take out the tube and all. But before the last 2 days, she used to tell, keep the BiPAP machine, so that she'll just keep the BiPAP and sleep off. She'll be dosing off most of the time. And the very next day she passed away. Maybe I used to think I should have talked to her long back. And about the spiritual aspects, I really didn't know what spiritual history should I ask for, or how to ask for it. It was completely ignorant of that part, how to speak to her about that. So is it relevant in a ICU patient or a ventilated patient also? Should we talk about this, or is there a possibility to talk about it? Will it help them? And the other thing, social aspects are like, I strongly feel, unlike cancer patients, cardiac and respiratory patients are not getting any palliative care referral as such. Should we plan something like that for chronic patients or something? Because anyway, all these like EF of 20 and 30 cardiac failure, they come, they're anyway going to not going to live for more than 6 months or 1 year. But none of them get a palliative care as such, a referral or a counseling session or any advanced planning, or nothing of that sort happens in our hospital, at least, or at least in our Indian setting, I think. Or can we do anything about it? And we as a team should work on counseling protocol. Yeah, we don't have any counseling protocol currently for our patients who are very sick or who might die after surgery. So is there any available protocol which we can follow? If there is any suggestions, please help us. So these are the questions I thought for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Punita, and thank you for bringing up a patient story, because you are in the anesthesia department where people talk only to machines, not to the patients. That's what we see regularly, and you have had a lot of information about this patient. So thank you for bringing it to us.
Yeah.
So I think I'll, for the discussion purpose, I will leave apart for Shreya's purpose all the complicated medical terms away. And this is just a lady who has been living with a heart issue for many, many years, and they could not treat because of lack of money. And they employed this money within 3 years, and they came to a city where they don't know the language, they don't have anyone known surrounding them for a complicated surgery per se, and in an ICU. So over to you, Shreya. So that just leave apart all the medical terms.
Yes, so I'm just going to ignore the medical terms. Um, as a layperson, first of all, Dr. Punitawati, thank you. This is very detailed. Even though you said there was no formal counseling or that you did, but this is very very detailed and. Coming from as in like being in palliative care, this story is a little disheartening as well. Um, First of all, did that person lack of awareness about palliative care in medical institutes is normal. We only think palliative care is given for people during the end of life care, which is not true. Palliative care can be given to anyone during their course of treatment. And one of the aspects that I really thought maybe could have changed a few things was getting in touch with the younger son and the neighbors and the sister who was taking care of the younger son. So because the communication was with the only son who had put in his life savings, and poor guy is quite young, so all that money he would have made, he tries to save his mom, which is a very natural thing for people to react to, especially how they want to save their loved one. But I think the team could have explored the extended family and the son and their sister as well. That's something I think that's where that genogram and the ecomap really helps, because sometimes I think they could have helped the son come up with a more rational maybe decision regarding what needs to be done. And also, like you said, there was a barrier between the son and the patient. There was some sort of communication barriers. And these communication barriers could have been sorted with the help of a translator and maybe a counselor if you have one in your team. And so these are just some of the thoughts that came across. And I think looking at the presentation that was just given, a lot of questions could have been answered through that, like even a simple spiritual assessment on what that lady wanted. She was worried about her son, and what was she really worried about her son? Was he because he was spending so much money on the treatment of care, or what is he going to do? There's just so many aspects. He's a young person. She has the lady has a life story as well. She's been through trauma of abuse and various things. So I think a lot of there's a lot we could have done. If I'm not sure, ma'am, do you have a counselor in your team or anyone in Vaidhi Medical Institute?
We have a team of medical social workers, but they are mostly used for this during the camp of purposes only. In the department where they don't come here to the ward or field, or we don't have a organized plan or counseling thing happening.
Yes. So I think there needs to be, even if there was a team, even the same medical social workers could have assessed the situation. And because what tends to happen, maybe the doctors didn't have time. So I think that could have really helped the patient and the son. Um, Also, yes, there are protocols. For example, there are minimal standards for palliative care that are available, which can be shared with you, where you just need a person who's trained in palliative care, a nurse who's trained in palliative care, and maybe a medical social worker. And it's not that difficult to do plan, as in include psychosocial aspects in the plan of care, and also creating awareness about palliative care within the medical fraternity is very very important, with the hospital administration, different departments. There is a lot of awareness that can be created. And as of now, these are some of the points that came into my mind. But if anyone has any other suggestions, please feel free.
Yeah, I would like to hear from other participants also whether you have something to discuss about this scenario. Dr. Punita, you can try to make use of these social workers to sensitize them a little bit about communication in advanced illness, and making use of these social workers for this kind of counseling can be helpful, I think. It takes time. It may not happen one fine day, but and now you have some idea about palliative care, so you can also do some sensitization among the other professionals, other specialists. And as Dr. Sunita was mentioning in the last session, asking the surprise question: would you be surprised if the patient would have died in a year when she came for this treatment? I don't think I would be surprised if the patient would die in a year, because from your description, whatever you have told, and the surgery which was offered to them 20 or 15 years back,
Yeah.
the things have changed. She has changed as a person, but in their mind, they would be accumulating money just for this purpose. So it takes time for them to accept the fact that they have crossed that line where surgery would have been the option to take the patient out of the misery. So I think and that surprise question, sensitizing your own colleagues there and in this uh, palliative care, and when to refer is very, very important.
And these counselings are better done as a team, or we like how is it?
So there are two contexts. I work with Pallium, where we talk to the patient, the doctor will talk, the nurse will talk. As you said exactly in your presentation, they talk mostly to nurses than to the doctors or to anyone else. So the nurses will tell us. So we make this nurse also sit with us when we talk to the patient, and the social worker or the psychologist, whoever is involved. So we talk to the patient as a team sometimes. Sometimes patient do get connected to one particular person, so that particular person will be leading the conversation mostly. But when I worked in a setting like yours, I was working in Manipal. So it's a setting like yours, where we get patients in the ICU, where we communicate all these things. There also we sit, the ICU physician will be there, the palliative care physician will be there. So whoever the specialist, suppose a neurologist is involved, the neurologist will be there, the cardiologist will be there. So everyone have a discussion among ourselves what to talk to the patient. We should have an opinion, have a consensus among ourselves how to take this forward, and then we call the family and we all sit together and then talk to the patient. So that is rather than patient running from one doctor to other and having a whole lot of misunderstanding. We all sit together, we discuss among ourselves what to be communicated, what is the treatment decision plan for from our side. Then we all sit together, and the patient and the family will or mostly the family, because the patient will be in the ICU. So the family members, the decision makers, everyone will sit together and decide and document things. So that is how it can be done in your setting.
So when all of us are of the team are there, then we communication also becomes clear. Like one person tells different thing
Exactly.
and other
Yeah.
person tells something different.
So this kind of conversation we do only in groups.
Okay.
There is no talking when you're going for rounds. You don't promise anything, because we don't know what your cardio fellow is going to tell you, what the physician is going to tell you. So whenever the patient, bystander or caregiver is asking a question, we tell them, okay, we'll come back to you. So then I go and ask the cardiologist, what is your plan? Or the neurologist, what do you think? And then we come into a consensus and we sit together and talk. So there is no chance of misunderstanding among the team members also, because we know exactly what we are supposed to talk to the patient. And patient is not confused, because everyone is sitting and talking the same thing.
Okay. Yeah.
Sometimes the nurse will also be involved, because it is the nurse who knows most of the things. So we usually call the nurse also to have the conversation.
Okay. Okay. That is helpful, ma'am. Then we can like a weekly meeting or something like that. We can call all the patients one by one. Saturdays we can
Yes.
call other consultants also will be free.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this happens with this we do with every ICU patient whose prognosis is to be discussed, or uh, there is some confusion in terms of management. They usually bring in the palliative care physician to coordinate all these meetings.
Okay.
So we go there as the coordinator of all these meetings, and then talk to them in a way where they can understand.
Okay.
So it works really well. It works really. It's very clear to the caregivers. So because everyone is sitting together and talking.
How frequently you would
Document.
do it, ma'am, for a patient?
it depends. Sometimes with one conversation, the patient will have the caregivers will have a lot of acceptance, but sometimes it takes multiple sittings.
Sitting. Okay.
So
Okay.
after first meeting, maybe one person can take the lead, because the patient's caregivers knows that, okay, this doctor was there in that meeting, so she or he knows everything about it. So the next day, usually the palliative care people will be seeing from next day onwards, not all the specialists all the time. But for the initial meeting or the second meeting, everyone will be sitting together.
Okay. Yeah. Now I got it. Yeah.
Sorry, we overshot the time by 5 minutes. I hope something from our side would help you in managing patients further. And we
Yeah.
would like to hear
Thank
from you regarding the pain management of the patient that you presented.
That
Send us
patient,
an email.
yeah, ma'am. Actually, I wanted to send her photo also. Then I thought, okay, I should not present it. She has started getting up and walking to the bathroom with the help again. Her knee joint swelling had come down. She took a 1 week course of steroid, ma'am. Bisolone 5 milligram was given for her for TID for 3 days and BD for 3 days and OD for 3 days, and then stopped. With that, she really improved, and I started on Bupri only 5 mg patch for her.
Okay.
Along with that, tapentadol 50 mg 4 times daily I had told, but though they have given 100 BD. She's 40 kg. Then I means when they came for follow up, I told them you cannot give, like, she is very thin. The spacing is very important. Like, it wouldn't act so long and all. So you have to give 4 times daily only. But what happened in 2 days after the Bupri patch has taken over, they have made tapentadol SOS. And what happened when the second time patch was changed, there was problem there, like we had to put back on, there was a swelling in the knee joint again, and I had to cover up with this tramadol and paracetamol combination, Ultracet. Ultracet full dose I had to give for 3 days. After 3 days, it came down. Now she is back on wheelchair. She's not on bed anymore. She's back on wheelchair and she is moving around in the house again.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. I don't know whether there were any questions because we just overshot the time. If there are any questions, kindly send us through WhatsApp or through email. We'll get back to you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Shreya, for your session and your time and your valuable inputs.
Yeah, the presentation was nice. She will share the presentation, ma'am. It was nice,
Yes,
actually.
Yes. It will be shared.
Yeah, thank you, Shreya. It was very nice.
Thank you, Dr. Sridevi. Thank you, everyone. And please send in your questions and your feedback as well.
There is a feedback link sent to the chat session now. So please, before logging out, just fill in the feedback and leave the meeting. Raju, did you stop the poll now?
I think yes, ma'am. Echo India told the feedback link is more what they want than polls.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. We will see you next Friday. Just click on the link and do give your feedback. If you have any questions, do reply to our email or to our WhatsApp group. We will definitely respond to it. Thank you all.